From the halls of Montezuma, Kansas, that is, to wherever you may be, this is the Sure and Secure Podcast, a ministry of Morningside Community Church, helping you become sure that Christianity is true and that your salvation is secure through Jesus Christ. I'm Pastor Tim Erickson. Thanks for listening today. Hello and welcome back to the podcast. Thanks for listening to this episode. Thanks for listening again and giving me an opportunity to hopefully teach you a little something and perhaps to be a little blessing to your day. In this episode, I'm going to start a short series of episodes dealing with the sure side of things, talking about how we can be sure that Christianity really is true. Now, as time goes by on the podcast, we're going to dig into this in much more depth and detail. But for now, I just want to do a rather short 3-episode series on this topic. It's important that we deal with this first before we consider the secure side of things, the security of our salvation and our assurance of salvation. We've got to deal with the sure side first. Because if we feel secure in Christianity, and yet it turns out to be false, then what have we really gained in the end? In fact, perhaps we have lost everything in the end because we have believed in something that was ultimately not true. If we feel secure, but Christianity is actually false, our feelings of security will eventually be shattered by something, whether it's something we face in this life or something we face after this life. So it really is vital that we be sure that Christianity is true. I imagine the passengers on the Titanic felt very secure in the boat's ability to get them through any hazard that they might face. But in the end, their confidence just didn't hold water, did it? Well, because the boat started to hold water and, well, anyway, there's a bad preacher joke for you. Let me sum up the thoughts this way. A feeling of security in our faith won't do us any good if the foundation of our faith is faulty. Let me say that again. A feeling of security in our faith won't do us any good if the foundation of our faith is faulty. So today, let's start to make sure that the foundation of our faith really can stand strong. Well, today in this episode, I hope to begin to convince you to believe this very straightforward claim. We can know the truth about reality, and reality insists that there is a God. Now, how exactly does reality insist that there is a God? Well, we'll talk about that in the next episode because we need to spend our whole time in this episode talking about the first part of that claim. We can know the truth about reality. Now, why discuss this? That seems like a pretty non-controversial statement, doesn't it? Well, we find ourselves living in strange times when people actually think it makes sense to say something like, "That's true for you, but it's not true for me." Even if we don't hear people express their thoughts in those exact words, we hear that idea around us all the time, don't we? That something might be true for you and yet not be true for me. We've got to clear that idea away from the get-go, really for 2 reasons. First, we have to clear it away when we're talking to someone else about our faith. We might give them a passionate case for why Christianity is true, and after we're done, they might pull this out like some rhetorical trump card and say, "Well, I'm so glad that that's true for you, but it's just not true for me." So if we are going to be as persuasive as we can be as witnesses for Jesus Christ, we've got to clear this idea away for other people. But secondly, we've also got to clear this idea away for ourselves. We don't want to find ourselves struggling with the thought that our Christian faith might be nothing more than just a personal opinion. A personal opinion isn't strong enough to base your life upon. We need to know that our Christian faith is a real expression of reality, that it truly does tell us the way things really are. Now, this idea that a claim could be true for you but not for me is called relativism. Maybe you've heard that term before, relativism. And unfortunately, it has infected our society at all levels. Not just the level of the man on the street, but at all levels, even among people who really ought to know better, like Supreme Court justices, for example. Consider this statement from Justice Anthony Kennedy. He wrote this in his opinion for the case Planned Parenthood versus Casey back in 1992. And here's part of what he wrote. At the heart of liberty is the right to define one's own concept of existence, of meaning, of the universe, and of the mystery of human life. Now, at first glance, that statement might sound somewhat appealing, huh? Especially if you have a rather conservative view of the government's role. You might hear that statement from Justice Kennedy and you might think, well, sure, I don't want the government telling me how to think or what opinions I ought to hold. I don't want the government defining my concept of existence and of meaning. But ultimately, that statement from Justice Kennedy is simply false. And it has implications that absolutely no one is willing to accept, not even Justice Kennedy himself. I mean, just imagine if I was able to speak to Justice Kennedy and I said, you know, Justice, I would find it so meaningful to steal your credit card and go on a shopping spree with it. You know, I define my own concept of existence by pretending to be other people through identity theft. So I'm sure you wouldn't mind if I stole your social security number and your bank information and just pretended to be you so I could enrich myself. Well, obviously, Justice Kennedy would tell me that that is not an acceptable way to define my concept of meaning and existence. He would tell me I am not free to define my own concept of existence or of meaning that way. Ultimately, what he wrote is not even what political liberty is all about. If he really believed his own words, he shouldn't have even rendered a decision in the case. Because by rendering a decision, he was deciding whose concept of meaning would be upheld by force of law. By rendering a decision, he decided that one group's definition of existence and meaning was going to be upheld over some other group's definition of existence and of meaning. So unfortunately, we find relativism infecting even the highest echelons of power in our society. Now, in contrast to relativism is what we might call objectivism or objectivity. This is the view that if a statement is true, then it's true for all people at all times in all places. This idea is built on the observation that truth simply expresses reality. And this observation is called by the phrase the correspondence theory of truth. The correspondence theory of truth. This is simply the assertion that truth is that which corresponds to reality. Now, don't worry about the terminology too much. That's really just a more sophisticated way of saying what you have probably always thought, the truth to be. It's just another way of saying that truth is telling it like it is. A statement is true if it matches reality or if it correctly expresses reality, and it's false if it doesn't match reality. For example, just consider if I were to say, oh, it's breezy outside today. Well, here in Montezuma, Kansas, that statement is almost always true. It is almost always breezy around here. And so, since it is breezy in reality, if I say it's breezy, then my statement is true. If I said that, however, on one of the rare calm days that we have around here, well, in that case, then my statement would be false because it's not expressing the way things really are. Or if I said I had cereal for breakfast this morning, well, that statement would be true because I did in fact have cereal for breakfast this morning. So again, don't get hung up on the terminology about this. I understand some of you might like to be familiar with the terminology, and so I want to use that for you. But again, this idea of objectivism and the correspondence theory of truth is that truth just means that we tell it like it is. Now, the heart and soul of objectivism is that true statements simply describe reality. And since we all live in the same reality, then truth is the same for all of us. If I make a true statement, then that statement is going to be true for you and for me and for everyone because we live in this shared reality. So maybe now you can start to see very clearly how ridiculous it is to say something like, well, that's true for you, but it's not true for me. Let's just rephrase that a little bit and put our definition of truth in there. That would be like saying, well, that may correspond to reality for you, but it doesn't correspond to reality for me. Well, that can't possibly be the case because we all live in the same reality. Whoever you might be speaking to, they don't live in a different reality than you do. They live in the same reality that you do. So a statement that is true for you is going to be true for them as well. Ironically, you can't deny objectivity without affirming it. And this is one of the ways that we clearly know that objectivity is true, because a denial of objectivity is self-defeating. Just imagine if someone said, truth is relative to the opinions of each person. Truth is just a matter of the opinions that each person holds. Well, even though this next part is unspoken in that claim, what the person is really saying is that that's how truth is for all people at all times in all places. If someone said truth is just relative to the opinions of each person, imagine if you disagreed with them. Wouldn't they say you were wrong? Wouldn't they say that your disagreement is expressing a falsehood? They believe that their statement is not just a mere opinion, but that it's actually describing reality. So relativism is simply a self-defeating position. It disproves itself as it tries to make its own point. Or in other words, it fails the very test that it sets up. Here's another example, just to kind of help you understand this idea of a self-defeating position a little bit more. Imagine if I said all sentences in English contain 4 words or less. Well, that statement itself was in English, wasn't it? But it had more than 4 words. And so that statement was self-defeating because it failed the very test that it was trying to establish. And so ultimately, this is how we know relativism cannot possibly be true because it defeats itself. Now, even statements about personal experiences or preferences state objective truths. Sometimes people deny this, and they might use statements about personal experiences as a supposed example of a relative truth. For example, consider the statement, I feel cold. Now, at first, that might seem like a relative truth, because I might feel cold, but the person sitting next to me might not feel cold. He or she might feel warm. Husbands and wives know the truth of that very well, don't they? One person might feel cold, the other person might feel very warm. And so sometimes people might point to a statement like that and say, aha, look, here's an example of a relative truth. Well, it's actually not a relative truth. The only thing that's relative about that statement is the pronoun, the word I. If we clarify the pronoun, then it becomes quite clear that this is really an objective truth. What I am actually saying in that statement is I, Tim Erickson, feel cold. Now, if I, Tim Erickson, do actually feel cold, then that statement is true not only for me, but for you as well. Because I'm not talking about your experience right now, am I? I'm talking about my experience. So the statement, Tim Erickson feels cold, would be true for you and for me and for anyone else. Because again, it's simply talking about my experience and not anyone else's experience. Well, let me deal with some objections to this whole idea of objectivity, because this is an idea that dies rather hard. People don't want to let go of the idea that truth is relative because it allows them to so easily dismiss viewpoints that they disagree with. It feels like such a helpful tool when you encounter something that you don't want to say is true. So people really cling strongly to this idea of relativism. So let me help you think through this by dealing with some objections. First of all, what about personal bias? We hear an awful lot about personal bias these days. Don't my personal beliefs and experiences leave me with a bias that prevents me from seeing things the way they really are? So, in light of my personal bias, how could we really be objective? Well, the first thing we need to note is that this isn't really an argument against the existence of objective truth. It's really an argument about whether or not we can know objective truth. Here's something important for you to understand. There could still be objective truth out there, even if none of us could ever know it. What do I mean by that? Well, here's a little analogy for you. Imagine a world in which all human beings were physically blind. Not a single human being had the faculty of sight. Well, in that world, there would still be a physical world around us, even though none of us could ever see it. And there's a similar principle that holds when we talk about our knowledge. There could be objective truth out there, even if none of us could ever, quote unquote, see it with our minds. And so this objection doesn't really disprove the existence of objective truth. It just raises a doubt about whether we can really know what that objective truth is. Well, this objection against our knowledge doesn't stand up for at least two reasons. First off, it is also self-defeating. The person who makes this objection is claiming that he or she can see how things really are for everyone. If someone says everyone is biased, no one can see things the way they really are, that's a self-defeating claim because that speaker is claiming to see the way things really are for everyone. In other words, the speaker, when he or she makes that statement that everyone is hopelessly biased, the speaker has to either include himself or exclude himself. Now, if he includes himself in that, then all he's expressing to us is his own personal bias. And we have no reason to accept it as true because it's just his own personal bias about things. But if he excludes himself, he has become self-defeating. He has disproven the very point he is trying to make because he is saying that he has somehow escaped the personal bias that everyone else has and that he is seeing things the way they really are. So it is false in that case that everyone is hopelessly biased. So it's a self-defeating position. And that means, as I've said before, that it cannot possibly be true. But there's a second observation we need to make about this, and that is the fact that people can and do change their minds. People change their minds all the time, and not just about insignificant things like their favorite food or their favorite sports team or something like that. But people change their minds about their most foundational beliefs, like whether or not there is a God, or whether or not Jesus rose from the grave. These are life-shaping beliefs. And people change their minds about these things, which shows us that we must not be completely trapped within our own perspectives. If we were completely trapped within our own perspectives, then we would never be able to embrace a different point of view because we could never even see an issue from a different point of view. Now, this is not to say that our biases might not be very strong. Oftentimes, they are. Our biases can be very strong, but ultimately they are not determinative. And that's the point I'm trying to make. Our biases don't ultimately determine exactly what we think, because if they did, well, then they would always defeat any other point of view that we're trying to consider. And if that were the case, then we would never be able to change our minds. But the fact that people can and do change their minds shows us that our personal bias does not leave us completely unable to see things the way they really are. Well, how about a second objection? We could call this the arrogance objection. Consider this statement. It seems arrogant to say that I know the truth about something and everyone should agree with that truth. Aren't we supposed to be humble people as Christians? Well, now this could be a rather strong objection, huh? Now we're starting to talk about Christian morality. And boy, we certainly don't want to be arrogant people. We do want to be humble. And so is it actually arrogant to claim that you know the truth, that you're seeing things the way they really are? Well, the reality is we simply cannot avoid making statements that we believe are objectively true, because deep down we just know that this is how truth is, that a true statement is true for you and for me and for everyone. A person who wants to make this objection is actually saying, here's a truth I know that everyone should agree with. It's arrogant to claim that you know a truth that everyone should agree with. And yet the person who says that doesn't think he's being arrogant, right? He simply thinks he's correct. He just thinks he's seeing things the way that they really are. So it's really not arrogant to hold to objectivism or objectivity. It's just recognizing a feature of reality, that this is how truth really is. Humility really deals more with how we assign value to ourselves as compared to God and to other people. Do I consider myself to be greater than God or less than God? Do I consider myself to be God's master or God's servant? Do I consider myself to be greater than others or equal to others? Do I consider their needs and interests more important than my own, as we're told to do in Philippians chapter 2? Or do I not do that? Those are the kinds of questions that humility is really concerned with. Well, how about one final objection? This one also touches on an element of our Christian faith. And the objection could be stated like this: if I think I know the truth about something that everyone should agree with, won't that make me unteachable? Won't that make me a closed-minded person who never listens to other people? Doesn't the book of Proverbs tell me that it's foolish to not listen to correction from other people? Well, this is an important objection because, again, we want to be wise. We certainly want to follow the teaching of Proverbs. But here with this objection, we need to understand that even if I'm convinced I'm right about something, I can still give a fair and honest hearing to other ideas. This observation is just another feature of the fact that my personal bias, or we could just say personal perspective, doesn't leave me totally incapable of viewing a matter from a different point of view. So even if I'm absolutely convinced that I'm correct, I can still give a fair and honest hearing to the viewpoints of other people. Now, when we consider the book of Proverbs, it's not necessarily dealing with truth claims as much as it's dealing with matters of personal conduct. Any one of us could be mistaken about the best way to behave in a certain situation. We might simply be inexperienced when it comes to that situation. That's why Proverbs talks about the naive person in various places. That person is just someone who doesn't have enough life experience to see what is wise in a situation or to see the potential dangers of a situation. So, because of that, it is extremely wise to listen to advice from other people and to consider what they have to say, even if they are intending to correct you. It's still wise to consider what they have to say and consider that they might potentially be right. Now, the book of Proverbs certainly is not saying, you really should be open to the idea that God doesn't exist after all. That certainly is not the kind of open mindedness that Proverbs is encouraging us to have. And so, if we believe in the objectivity of truth, we are certainly not being foolish. We are simply being factual. Well, I hope you have become convinced that we can know the truth about reality. I hope you'll join me on the next episode of the podcast as I help you see how reality insists that there is a God. If you haven't done so already, I hope you'll consider subscribing to the podcast so that you'll always be alerted when a new episode is released. Thank you for listening today. May God bless you.